It's a great pleasure and a privilege for me to be here, and I'm delighted that this important forum is focusing on climate change and energy, because as Mr. Jack Short and the distinguished speakers before him have reminded us, this is an area, this is a set of issues which really cannot be ignored much longer. And given the challenges that we have ahead, clearly we need to put in place strategies and actions by which we would be able to get to our destination, which I think this planet and the future of humanity and all living beings clearly require. I do want to also remind you, if a reminder is required at all, that with energy prices at unprecedented levels, there is a strong market case, apart from the fact that there are environmental and other compulsions which require a major change in direction. But certainly, the price of energy today requires us to put in place a set of initiatives that certainly reflect the reality that energy is going to become increasingly scarce. As someone said, it's not as though oil needs to run out, because after all, the Stone Age didn't end because there were no stones around. There were other economic, technological, and other considerations which brought about a shift away from the Stone Age. We are, of course, charting difficult territory when it comes to forecasting the price of energy, but I think all enlightened entities necessarily take into account what's going to happen if we don't indulge in the right kind of action, and what action should be taken in hand if we want to avoid economic dislocation and difficulties in the future. I myself have studied the global oil market in some depth and detail. In fact, I published a book in 1985, which was published by Johns Hopkins University Press, which looked at the global energy scenario, and I projected prices of oil for the future, which unfortunately belied my projections, because in 85 is when oil prices crashed, and quite incidentally, the sales of my book crashed as well. So I'd like to present before you some findings of the fourth assessment report of the IPCC and what the implications are for the transport sector. So let me get into an important statement which we have brought out as a very clear conclusion in the fourth assessment report, that being the warming of the climate system is unequivocal. And there is now really no place for scientific doubt, because not only do we have adequate observations and analysis based on them, which clearly give us enough confidence to say that climate change is unequivocal. And if we look at changes that have taken place during the periods beginning with the Industrial Revolution, the top part of this diagram gives you a plot of changes in global average temperature that have taken place. And naturally, there are ups and downs in this curve, as you would see, and that's essentially because climate change is the sum total of natural as well as man-made factors. Nature brings about changes in the climate through a variety of drivers. It's, for instance, well known that sunspots, solar activity have a major impact. Volcanic activity has a major impact. But what is particularly important to see the last 50 years as evidence of the rate of change that has taken place. And you would observe that this particular graph has become steeper in the last 50 years. And overall, I'd like to mention that during the 20th century, we had an average temperature increase of 0.74 degrees Celsius, which is more than what we had estimated in the previous assessment report of the IPCC. Average sea level has been going up as a result on account of two factors. Firstly, the expansion, the thermal expansion of the oceans, and secondly, because of the melting of the ice bodies across the globe. And the average increase in sea level during the 20th century was 17 centimeters. So that's pretty close to about a foot in terms of increase in sea level. And the last diagram at the bottom shows you changes that have taken place in snow cover in the northern hemisphere. And the reason why we're talking about the northern hemisphere is because the largest land area on this earth actually exists on the northern hemisphere. And therefore, it's obvious that snow cover on land areas has gone down substantially, essentially in the northern hemisphere. There are major impacts of climate change, and this is based on observations. Extreme precipitation events, these are occurring all over the world, and this picture gives you the kind of effects that this can produce. Heat waves are going up. Certainly cyclonic and hurricane activity is changing, and there's an increase in the frequency as well as the intensity of floods as well as droughts. And we know that continued emissions of greenhouse gases at or above current rates would cause further warming and induce many changes in the global climate system during the 21st century. And these would very likely be larger than those observed during the 20th century. So we are clearly on a path which is becoming ever more difficult in terms of the extent of climate change and its impacts. And these are projections of the future which take us to the end of the 21st century. And we've examined a number of scenarios, and based on those, we have come up with what we say is the best estimate at the lower end, which would be roughly 1.8 degrees Celsius, and at the upper end, we have the best estimate of 4 degrees Celsius. Now, even if we look at the lower projection, that combined with 0.74 degrees, which was the increase in the 20th century, will give us a total warming of well over 2.5 degrees Celsius. And that clearly would cause major impacts that would certainly disrupt a whole range of activities and, of course, pose some major threats to habitation and human life. There are several negative impacts on Europe, which I just want to inform you about as an example. Inland and coastal flooding, health risks due to heat waves, reduction of water availability and crop productivity in southern Europe. The Mediterranean region in particular is very vulnerable, and our projections clearly indicate that as you go to the higher latitudes in the northern hemisphere, you have an increase in precipitation, average precipitation, and as you go to the lower latitudes, there's a tendency for decrease in precipitation. But the Mediterranean really falls under the category of the lower latitudes. It has exactly the same set of changes that are taking place in terms of precipitation levels. And there's also major loss of species and reduced snow cover in the mountains. So these are impacts of climate change, which as an illustration, I would like to place before you, requiring very serious consideration, because they clearly have major implications not only for economic activities, but also for all forms of life on this planet. The impacts on poor regions are particularly serious. People exposed to increased water stress by 2020. Our projections indicate that there would be anywhere from 120 million to 1.2 billion in Asia, 12 to 81 million in Latin America, and Africa, which already has a substantial level of stress as far as water availability is concerned, would have something like 75 to 250 million people suffering from additional stress as a result of climate change. There are also major impacts on agriculture, and that's becoming increasingly evident based on research that's being carried out. We project that by 2020, we may have a decline of 30% in yields. By 2050, a major decline in yields in Central and South Asia, up to 30%, and 30% by 2080 in Latin America, 50% by 2020 in some African countries. And you can imagine what the impacts of such a development would be, because we already are in the grips of a food crisis, where food prices have gone up substantially in the last few months. And those countries where populations spend 70 or 80% of their income on food alone are clearly hit very badly because they are in no position now to import food from elsewhere to meet their very basic demands. And what is even more worrisome is the fact that crop revenues could fall by 90% by 2100 in Africa. So there are certain parts of the world where we really need a very clear focus on actions that need to be taken to ensure that we don't have disruption of life and a threat to peace and security. The fact that the Norwegian Nobel Committee gave the last Nobel Peace Prize to the IPCC and Mr. Al Gore clearly highlights the fact that there is a link between climate change and the maintenance of peace and security on the earth. What we need is a set of measures, therefore, by which we can adapt to the impacts of climate change, because even if we were to stabilize the Earth's atmosphere and therefore the climate at current levels, the inertia in the system will ensure that climate change continues for several decades. And therefore, we've really locked in the planet into a certain level of climate change to which we have no choice but to adapt. And I'll mention some of the measures that are required. And adaptation is necessary to address impacts resulting from the warming, which is unavoidable, as I mentioned, due to past emissions. But we know that adaptation alone cannot cope with all the projected impacts of climate change. We have reached the threshold in several parts of the world beyond which adaptation will really not work, and we would therefore have to ensure that we take mitigation measures. As you have heard from the distinguished ministers earlier today, we need to bring about mitigation of emissions of greenhouse gases, and that's clearly a major challenge for the transport sector. We need, therefore, a mix of strategies which include adaptation as well as mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. And to give you some indication of the kind of opportunities that we have, if we want to stabilize the global mean temperature increase to say between 2 degrees to 2.4 degrees Celsius, then we would have to stabilize the current concentration of greenhouse gases at more or less the same level as we have today. And this clearly means that we have a very short window of time in which we need to bring about a transition. Globally, it is evident that if we want to stabilize the temperature increase at this level shown in the uppermost row of this table, then we have to bring about a reduction in emissions by 2015 at the latest. This gives us only 7 years, and therefore there is a sense of urgency in taking action. If we don't, then clearly we are going to see temperature increases which will exceed 2 degrees to 2.4 degrees Celsius. And this in itself, there is now increasing evidence to show, could really cause major impacts that would cause huge problems for human society. Incidentally, the good news is that the cost of this level of stabilization is not going to be high. So that clearly dispels some of the myths that have been spread, where it's been made to believe that there would be a major loss of jobs and economic output. As a matter of fact, if you look at this level of stabilization, which more or less corresponds with the temperature stabilization that I indicated earlier, the total cost in 2030 to the global economy would be less than 3% of the GDP. But if you take into account all those that we list as so-called co-benefits, I mean, take the transport sector. If we were to bring about a radical transformation of the transport sector, whereby, let's say, you didn't have to use cars on the same scale that we do today, or which we might do if emissions are not reduced, then what would really happen is that we would have massive congestion, we would have much higher levels of local air pollution. And therefore, if we were to mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases, let's say by restructuring the transport sector, we would also have benefits in terms of lower pollution levels and lower congestion. And these are core benefits that would essentially reduce the cost of the measures that we are going to take to mitigate. So in other words, these core benefits would make it much more attractive economically for us to take these measures, because in some cases, you might actually end up with a negative cost. In other words, there would be a net benefit from taking some of these measures. Certainly, if you were to estimate the cost of congestion, it can be huge. This was done in Thailand some years ago, and the results were quite staggering. If you look at the current status, the transport sector is responsible for 23% of world energy-related greenhouse gas emissions, 74% coming from road transport. So one unmistakable conclusion that you come up with is that you perhaps need a shift from road to other forms of transport, because that would reduce the share of emissions coming from the road transport sector. And we've just heard about the 650 million cars that are running on the roads today. After 1950, there was a massive increase in the population of transport vehicles in different parts of the world. And this, incidentally, was a rate of growth 5 times faster than the growth of population. That means vehicle ownership has really intensified during this period. And freight transport, which consumes 35% of all transport energy, has been growing more rapidly than passenger transport. And it's expected that it will continue to do so. Now, it's also important that petroleum supplies 95% of the total energy used by transport. So here we see that actions that are required to mitigate emissions of greenhouse gases in the transport sector could also bring about higher levels of energy security, because obviously petroleum supplies are going to be priced much higher in the future and would certainly get more scarce. And therefore, I think there would be benefits in shifting away from growing dependence on fossil fuels and oil in particular. CO2 emissions from transport have been projected by the WBCSD, and you can see the growth if we continue on an unabated path of growth. By 2030, we would have, as Mr. Jack Short told us, a massive increase, 80% higher than what we have currently as far as emissions are concerned. There are several mitigation technologies which need to be highlighted. We certainly need more fuel-efficient hybrid vehicles, cleaner diesel vehicles, a move to biofuels, but here may I submit that we have to be very careful in looking at all the implications of biofuels production and use, some of which could really be harmful in several other contexts. And therefore, what we really need to look for are biofuels that, for instance, don't conflict with production of food. Technologies that are projected to be commercialized before 2030, and I suppose with high oil prices, there would be an acceleration of commercialization of some of these technologies. Advanced electric and hybrid vehicles, second-generation biofuels, higher efficiency aircraft. But here I'd like to bring to your attention another important conclusion that we had in the IPCC Fourth Assessment Report. All the technologies that we need for moving in the direction of stringent mitigation levels are available today. Just for example, if we were to invest in public transport, for which we have some excellent technologies, then one would reduce the dependence on private vehicular transport, and this obviously will have an impact in reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. But we need something beyond technology innovation. We have to use certain instruments, policies, and practices. One important signal is a price on carbon. Unless we place a price on carbon, we're not going to get industry or consumers moving in the direction of low-carbon technologies. We certainly need regulations, standards, taxes, charges. Our good friend, the Mayor of London, Mr. Ken Livingstone, has lost the election, but one of the measures that he implemented, and it took a lot of courage to do that, was to impose a higher charge on cars entering central London, and that had a major impact. And he was in New Delhi some months ago when we thought he'd sail through in his re-election bid. Unfortunately, he didn't. He mentioned that he was going to then impose a tax on SUVs coming into central London of 10 pounds, 25 pounds a day. So possibly that went against him in the elections. It takes courage to be a forward-looking politician. Distinguished ministers will tell us that, I'm sure. We need change in land use because, a lot of cities and urban habitat have grown in a manner that was dependent totally on low prices of energy. We are not going to get those in the future. Change in lifestyles is extremely important. We really don't think twice before jumping into a car and just going a short distance. I think if we were to use bicycles, we were to walk a little more and use public transport, we could certainly make a difference. We certainly need very massive and major development of public transport. And this, may I say, is critically important in the developing countries, where in several cases we just don't have the infrastructure, and we need to invest on a large scale, which would require creating local capacity in towns and cities. Now, this is a picture which is very revealing. You look at the picture on the left-hand side, this assumes one person per car and filling up the entire street. If you look at the right-hand side, there's a bus that has exactly the same number of people, and you really don't need cars on the same scale at all. So there are huge co-benefits. You free up road space, you reduce congestion, and you certainly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, we also need to bring about certain adaptation measures. And here, may I say that there is clearly a correspondence between mitigation and adaptation. I want to give you just one example. In the city of Mumbai, we had in 2005 a massive downpour, a cloudburst, which completely paralyzed the city. And people were not able to get away simply because the roads were choked. I recall when Hurricane Rita hit Texas, there was a 100-mile-long traffic jam on the highways simply because everybody got into a car and they were trying to get away from the city. If you had good public transport, you would probably have been able to run a few special trains and got people out. So here you would bring about a mitigation in emissions of greenhouse gases, but this would also be a means by which you're adapting to the likelihood of much more such events in the future, where you may need to evacuate populations, particularly from coastal areas and so on. And I think the transport sector, if it is concerned about creating a planet that essentially is sustainable and will be able to manage the challenge of climate change, has to make a start by itself. And here I'd like to remind you of what Mahatma Gandhi said: be the change you want to see in the world. If we want to have a cleaner planet for the future of humanity, for our children, our grandchildren, and of course for ourselves, we need to make a beginning. And I'd like to appeal to this distinguished forum to perhaps take the initiative in bringing about change in the right direction. Thank you very much.